Okay, now we're in record mode, and we'll come right back to the slides. All right then, again, welcome everybody. Just a quick reminder that we're offering this for free, but we're happy to accept donations. That's what keeps Kettle Moraine Land Trust going. My name is Greg Reisky, and it's my pleasure to walk you through some of the wildflowers that we're likely to see in the southern Kettle Moraine region in the springtime. And I've taken a very broad interpretation of the Kettle Moraine region. So the photos that we see are predominantly from Walworth County. However, we do have a few from McHenry County, Illinois, and from Winnebago County, Illinois. And I even slipped in a couple of photos from much further up north in Wisconsin, just so that I could capture some of the phases of development of some of these plants before they're done blooming. So here's a quick view of the preserves and affiliated sites of Kettle Moraine Land Trust. The top 4 sites in the green type are the fee-owned properties that Kettle Moraine Land Trust manages as preserves for the public. The 2 in blue are Wisconsin DNR properties, and the 2 in brown are Walworth County parks. So the parks and the DNR properties are ones that we have adopted in the role of steward. We don't own the properties, but we help the owners to manage them. Strictly speaking, we haven't yet entered into a formal agreement regarding the Army Lake public access, but I'm going to bring that to the board at their next meeting, and we'll see if we can officially add that to our stable of sites. So a quick outline of the program, and because this particular photo is not labeled, I'll tell you that it's the maidenhair fern, and it's just something to offer a little bit of verdure here on the page. This is Adiantum pedatum, and the photo was taken from our Beulah Bluff Preserve. So the first section of content is going to be the early spring blooming flowers. And from there we'll go take a little side trip to Beulah Bog, which, as I noted, is one of the sites that we've adopted in the stewardship role. And we spent a little time there specifically just because the environment, the habitat, and the vegetation there is so distinctive. We'll move on into the middle period of spring before we then visit a small number of woody plants, shrubs, trees, and vines. And then we'll wrap up with a view of late spring bloomers. And when I define early, middle, and late spring, it's a very vague notion because certainly these dates overlap, and the period of bloom may vary from year to year, and certainly from location to location. So take that as just a broad stroke. So let's start off with the really early part of the season. This is actually pre-spring when we start to see this flower blooming. This is skunk cabbage, Symplocarpus foetidus, and it has a rather unique flower structure. You'll also note that throughout the program, the photographs will show the date that the photograph was taken, as well as its location. So Army Lake, for example, is the Army Lake public access area. McHenry County, if it doesn't list a particular preserve or site, it's because it's on private property. And if it's on private lands, I don't identify much more the location. Other than, for example, in this photo, which is marked Delavan, again, it's a property that we don't own, don't have a formal agreement with yet, but I can assure you that it's on Delavan Lake. Similarly here, Beulah, the photo on the right. Again, it's private property, but on or very near Beulah Lake. So taking a look at this flower, the structure is distinctive. It's what a botanist calls spathe and spadix. The spathe is this hooded section here, this reddish bit with the yellow dotting on it, and seen very prominent here in the Delavan photos. The spadix is this fleshy structure here covered by the hood of the spathe. And the spadix is actually just a modified spike that is studded with small flowers. So it doesn't look very showy, it's just poking up out of the ground. And if you look at the photo here at Army Lake, this is ice behind the bloom. So there in early March, it's certainly very common for there still to be ice on our lakes and snow on the ground. It gets its name skunk cabbage for a couple of reasons. Skunk because of the aroma. This early in the season, it's pollinated by flying insects like flies that are among the first to emerge from dormancy at the end of winter. And it has that sort of foul aroma, much like carrion, because that attracts the flies. The cabbage name comes from the leafy portion of the plant. And here you see it on the right from the Beulah area. This was taken just a few weeks ago, May 1st, so that the flowers by that time are pretty well gone, but the leaves are starting to unfurl. And you can see that they're broad, fleshy, and just a little reminiscent of cabbage. Skunk cabbage, Symplocarpus foetidus. We'll move on to the round-lobed Hepatica. And this is a plant that has undergone a number of changes in its botanical naming over the years. It's currently accepted as Anemone americana. Previously, it was known as Hepatica americana or Hepatica nobilis obtusa. So it goes by various names, but Hepatica was not only its genus name at one time, but it's also very much its common name. And you can see from the 4 photos here that the flowers can take on rather differing aspects. The one on the right from Peterson Island Woods this April, almost blue in color, very deep kind of violet. The one in the lower portion here from the Beulah area, almost pure white. And here above, you know, white with a little bit of streaking. There is a similar species, the sharp-lobed Hepatica, which is currently known as Anemone acutiloba. It has deeper lobes in the leaves, and the leaves are more pointed. And the flowers are more typically white and less frequently the violet or purple color. Dutchman's Breeches. This is a favorite woodland wildflower. I know that when my son was a little 5-year-old, he used to call them upside down pants. And they do in fact look like a pair of bloomers or leggings hanging upside down. The leaves are almost feathery-like, they're very delicate. Both of these were from private property in McHenry County, actually my wildflower garden. Dicentra, cucularia, this is in the fumitory family, the Fumariaceae. And one thing to note is that the fleshy underground portion of this plant is poisonous. So this is something to stay away from if you're ever involved in a foraging party. We'll talk more about that when we get to Toothwort.
Oh.
Bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. These also from my, my home garden from early and mid-April in recent years. Bloodroot takes its name from the sap. And if you look at the stems, you can see that they're reddish in color. So the root and the stem are filled with an orange or reddish sap. And again, Sanguinaria canadensis, same root as the red wine sangria, bloodroot. And here you can see bloodroot, toothwort, and Dutchman's breeches all growing together. Again, this is a garden setting in the early spring. And there's something that all of these wildflowers have in common, and that is that they are all have seeds that are dispersed by ants. It's a process called myrmeaquery, and ants are absolutely pivotal to the distribution of the seeds as they ripen. There's a little growth called an elaiosome that is attached to the seed itself. It's fleshy, it's nutritious, and the ants will collect the seeds, carry them back to their nest where they will take off the elaiosome and either eat it themselves or feed it to their larvae. And they'll toss the seeds into a midden, into a small chamber in their nest. And there the seeds will be protected from fire and from predation and able to sprout in a safe environment. So that's how it is that the plants end up getting moved around from place to place in the environment. All right, moving into the yellow flowers, Marsh Marigold, Caltha palustris. And this is one of our showiest of the early blooming flowers. It'll get started in April. We typically see it blooming anywhere from late March on through the first week in June. The photo on the right was taken at Natureland Park, and the other two from a couple of different sites within the Hepatica National Wildlife Refuge. The large photo in the center was from a site very near the state line, but just over the Illinois border, and that's part of the Hebron peatlands complex. And then the site below is also within the Hackmatack footprint, a site that's currently owned by a land conservancy in the Kennedy County. The showy 5 petals of Marsh Marigold are certainly a joy in spring. And again, I would ask you to go ahead and mute your microphones if you joined us late, just so that we don't have too many background distractions. Thanks. We're going to look at a couple of different members of the Brassicaceae family, the mustards. And whenever you hear mustard, cress, or rocket, those are 3 common names that are applied to members of the mustard family. Toothwort on the left is one that grows in our woodlands. Some call it cutleaf toothwort because of the laciniate aspect of the leaves that is sharply dissected. Cardamine concatenata is its current name. It had previously gone by the name of Dicentra. All of the mustards will have 4 petals. So both of these that are shown here have the typical 4 petals. Both happen to be white. But whereas toothwort lives in the woodlands, bulbous cress, Cardamine bulbosa, is native to calcareous wetlands, particularly calcareous meadows and fens. So the photos here are from our Jackson Creek Preserve and were taken just a couple of weeks ago. And bulbous cress is very often found in close proximity to the plant we just saw, Caltha palustris and Marsh Marigold. Now, toothwort has a couple of other common names as well. One of them is crinkle root, and the other pepper root. And this is one of those spring ephemerals that has a fleshy tuber-like structure called corm. It's a food storage structure underground. And this one is edible. Again, I discourage foraging in part because you can't tell the difference between the corm of Dutchman's breeches, which is poisonous, and that of toothwort, which is edible. But pepper root refers to the fact that the early settlers used to use it to spice up their stews. It has a peppery flavor. Crinkle root, because after they had harvested these corms, if they allowed them to dry out, just like you let a pea dry out, it will get wrinkled. So they called it crinkle root from the roots in storage. A couple more plants from the early part of the season. Trout lily on the left, Erythronium albidum. This was taken from the end of April this year. Pleasant Valley is one of the conservation district properties in McHenry County, just to our south. And this is one of those plants that will persist in a degraded woodland and may form dense carpets on the ground layer. And you'll see a lot of the leaves come up vegetative. They don't necessarily flower. This is one of those plants that if it sends up a single leaf, you won't see a flower from that node. But if it sends up a pair of leaves, you may see a flower spike coming up out of that node between the two leaves. And trout lily takes its common name from the mottled pattern on the leaves. You can see right here in the center that there is a trout-like pattern to the mottled on the leaves. Another common name for it is dogtooth violet, but I prefer trout lily because it actually is in the lily family and not related to violets. There is a yellow flowering species that occurs in our area. I've seen it in Milwaukee County and in Boone County, Illinois, and that is Erythronium americana, yellow trout lily. And then on our right, we've got the wild strawberry, Fragaria virginiana, very common throughout the area. It's a low-growing plant, and it'll spread through runners and from seed. You see the 5 white petals. This is a member of the rose family, Rosaceae. And the fruits are quite edible, quite sweet, but very small. So it's seldom that you ever get to collect more than 1 or 2. Bluebells and Bellwort. They're not directly related. Bluebells are in the borage family, Bellwort in the lily family. But they both have a bell-like appearance, so I paired them up here on the slide. You can see the buds just forming in the photo, small inset on the left from early April, and then the photo below from early May. And this will form large colonies, but they don't persist. That is to say, they'll come back next year, but they don't last through the summer. This is a showy plant, and it can be fairly large, more than 1 foot tall, but already it's past its bloom period, and it will very quickly disappear from the woodland floor. It tends to prefer shorelines, alluvial soils, stream terraces, benches, those sort of moist environments with a fine textured soil. Whereas the bellwort, Uvularia grandiflora, will grow in more upland areas. It likes rich mesic wetlands, or woodlands rather, and savannas. It's certainly known for its twisting, dangling petals. The leaves are slightly perfoliate, that is to say the base of the leaf wraps around the stem. And before it starts to bloom, some people confuse it with Solomon's seal or Solomon's plume. But certainly those yellow flowers are a real giveaway. And speaking of yellow flowers, we're going to want to visit the buttercups. These are some of our showy yellow flowers. They're all in the crowfoot family, the family Ranunculaceae. And in fact, a lot of our flowers that we're visiting here in our presentation today are in the Ranunculaceae family. It's well represented in the region. So we'll start with early buttercup, Ranunculus fasciculatus. It is an early bloomer. It will start coming out as late as the end of March. It'll bloom throughout April and through most of May. It's wrapping up its bloom season now. You'll often see this along trail sides where there's still good sunlight available. But it is a plant of savannas, so it likes some dappled shade. It also likes dry, sloped areas. This one happens to be from one of the sites that we're affiliated with in the Beulah area. In the center, we've got our small flowered buttercup, Ranunculus abortivus. And this is in full glorious bloom. You can barely see these 5 yellow petals around this central structure. So the petals are very tiny. It takes its name abortivus from the notion that it appears as if it tried to start blooming and then just aborted the whole effort. Still in all, it's a fairly attractive plant. It'll grow much taller, more than a foot tall, but it's inconspicuous because the flowers are so small. The leaves are varied. The colline leaves, that is the leaves that grow along the stem, can be 3-lobed or otherwise variable. The lower leaves tend to be kidney-shaped, and that gives the plant another common name, kidney leaf buttercup. And it's fairly common. In fact, it's really somewhat weedy. And then one of our larger, more robust buttercups, larger than the early buttercup and a little more dense in its foliage than the small flowered buttercup, and certainly larger in its bloom. This is swamp buttercup, Nunculus septentrionalis. And this is one from moist woods. It likes to have a fair amount of moisture. It'll grow in seeps and other mesic woodlands. So next we're going to move on to our little side trip to Beulah Bog. And I'll ask Sue at this point if there are any pressing questions from the early bloom group, and if not, we'll move it right into the bog.
There haven't been any pressing questions, but when you have a minute, you could ask and see if anyone. Laura had a comment on the plant that depends on ants, that this was a good reason to study ants.
Yes.
So we'll have to put that in our information about the project.
Great point, Laura, and thank you for sharing that, Sue. Quite a number of our spring ephemerals are disseminated by ants, the trilliums as well. There's quite a long list, and in fact there are tens of thousands of plants worldwide that depend on ants for distribution of the seeds. So here at Beulah Bog, the view you're looking at is of tamarack trees, Larix laricina. And the tamarack is one of the conspicuous tree denizens of our sphagnum bogs. They'll actually grow up right through the floating mat that often occurs in the central area of a bog beyond the shrub zone. It is a conifer, but it is deciduous. So it's like a pine that sheds its needles every fall. Here's another view of them growing up in the mat. That's the open water portion of Beulah Bog behind. So this photo is taken from the boardwalk. If you venture out to Beulah Bog anytime in the near future and you want to walk the boardwalk, I would encourage you to wear waterproof boots and take great care in walking there, because a good portion of the boardwalk is submerged right now. All of last year in the growing season, it was about ankle deep in water. I'm not sure how deep it is now, but our rainfall has been abundant and the boardwalk has slowly been sinking. So take great care and try not to step off the boardwalk. The floating mat is quite fragile, The plants are susceptible to damage, and it's entirely possible for a human being to step right through the mat and end up in much deeper water than you'd like. But the tamarack is able to grow in this shallow, wet soil environment consisting largely of sphagnum moss and a certain amount of peat buildup. And again, here's a close-up look of the cone, the little pine cone just forming. This photo is one of those that I took much further north. It was actually from late June last year. That red structure that you see right here is going to turn brown like any other pine cone would. They're not very large. They're about the size of a quarter or a nickel, and sort of globular in shape. So it's not pedant, it's roundish, orbicular. So there's a brief look at the tamarack tree, Larix lyricina. So let's take a look at the Allegheny serviceberry, Amelanchier levis. This is growing along the very edge of the moat, sort of between the savanna and the open water. It's difficult to see in the tangle at the left, other than you see a constellation of white flowers. The photo on the right gives us more of a close-up of the 5 petals, white flowers of the Amelanchier genus. There are several species that occur in the greater Chicagoland region. There's a small growing Amelanchier humilis, but this is more of the tree form Allegheny serviceberry. It's got beautiful fall foliage, sort of an apricot color. The bark is smooth and gray with sometimes dark striations. This is really a beautiful tree, and it has taken favor as a landscape tree. I've got a couple of them in my yard, and not only are they beautiful year-round, but the small fruits that they produce, which turn purple when ripened, are quite edible. So if you ever plant service berries in your yard, just be prepared to enter into lengthy negotiations with the birds, because they love them too. Also on the edge of the floating mat and the open watered moat, you'll find leatherleaf, Chamaedaphne caliculata. And leatherleaf is one of those plants that has a very narrow ecological niche. It is only going to be found in this narrow shrub zone in a sphagnum bog. And as a result, it's a very uncommon plant, known from only those stations that have that specific kind of habitat. It's in the heath family, the Ericaceae, along with several other bog plants. Blueberries and cranberries and whatnot. And this is another one that will keep its blooms for a long time. This shot from April 22nd is fairly early in its bloom season, generally speaking, but it may retain those flowers right on through the first or second week in June. The photo on the right is the flowering structure of the bog birch, Betula pumila. It's also known as dwarf birch. It doesn't typically attain tree size. Again, it's part of the shrub zone habitat on the edge of the sphagnum bog. What you're seeing here are the staminate flowers. They are aments or catkins. The staminate flowers being the male flowering structure.
I'm sure where this field bog is, but I wrote it down one time that we should go.
Sandra, you need to
The
mute.
leaves are very distinctive on the dwarf birch. They're obovate, meaning that they are broader beyond the middle of the leaf. The point of attachment is narrow. The leaf broadens into a paddle shape and is rounded at the tip. Very distinctive when you see it. It's one of those shrubs that you can generally tell the species just by looking at the leaves. So in the savanna, there are, upland areas surrounding the bog. And if you visit Beulah Bog, you'll have an opportunity to walk among the oaks and the hickories, and you'll see a lot of familiar and perhaps some unfamiliar woodland wildflowers there as well. So the two flanking the center photo, Mayapple on the left and Columbine on the right, we will revisit on their own pages a little elsewhere in the program. But here's a view of them early in the season. These photos were taken in April of this year, before the Columbine put up its flower stalk, before the Mayapple had fully opened its umbrella-like leaves. The plant in the center is a fairly rare plant. It's known as pale vetchling, Lathyrus ochroleucus, and it is a plant of well-drained morainic soils. And yet, because of the steep terrain at Beulah Bog, it can be found within a few meters of the edge of the open moat. But again, it's growing in the company of the oaks and the shooting stars and the columbine and the early buttercups and other typical spring wildflowers of the savanna. But the star of the bog is probably pitcher plant, one of the most charismatic of the bog flora. Sarracenia purpurea. It's in its own family, the Sarraceniaceae. The modified leaves, the basal leaves, form a rosette, and the leaves themselves curl and are fused to form these pitcher-like structures. And you can see that they're very red in this photo. They may be tinged with green. They may be conducting some photosynthesis, but this is primarily a carnivorous plant. It obtains most of its protein, at any rate, from animal organisms. And it's an unusual mechanism by which it does that. We'll look at that in a moment. But here, I want to show you a few days later, you still have these leaf structures here, and you get a little sense of the pitcher. And now this structure looks otherworldly. It almost appears to be plastic. It's smooth and shiny, and it's this perfect spherical ball on the tip of a smooth red stem. It does not look like what we typically consider a plant, but that is the flower bud. And that flower bud will grow a long stalk, probably a foot, foot and a half tall, with a beautiful waxy red bloom at the tip. And there it is, the flower stalk of the pitcher plant. And you'll see next to the flowering stalk is the dried stem from the prior year. So it has a crook shape to the stem, which you don't see. It's blocked by this bloom. And then behind it, of course, you've got a tamarack branch. Notice the little pine needles, and then tamarack trees in the background. That was also taken last June from up north. Now, what's interesting about the way the pitcher plant obtains its protein is that for many years, the assumption was, like most carnivorous plants, that the pitcher would collect rainwater. And within that rainwater, insects could be trapped. There are, in fact, downward pointing, sharp barbed leaves that line the inside of the leaf structure of the pitcher, which makes it difficult, even if possible, for an insect to climb back out once they have fallen in or gone in for a drink, and they can't get out again. So the common wisdom was that the plant would exude digestive juices that could then break down the structure of the organism that was trapped and essentially digest it and absorb that food material. Well, what's happening with the pitcher plant is a little bit different. Yes, those pitchers do collect water, and that little pool of water inside the pitcher actually becomes a tiny ecosystem of its own, There are organisms that find their way in there and live there. And they eat each other. And the pitcher plant, rather than digesting the live organisms, instead digests the waste products of those organisms. So this pitcher may be teeming with a variety of different insect larvae and other, small microscopic organisms. But among the larvae that utilize the pitcher plant, there is a very distinctive kind of mosquito. It is known only from breeding in the pitcher plant. I honestly don't know if it's a biting mosquito or not, but for those of you who are keeping track, the name is Wyemia smithii, the pitcher plant mosquito. So I think that's probably a good time to take a pause. We're close to halfway through the program, and we are halfway through our time. So it's a good opportunity to stretch. I'm going to stop sharing the slides for a moment. And if anybody has a question they'd like to pose audibly, you can unmute your microphone and let us know. And if not, we'll be happy to resume the program without further delay.
Greg, Jean had a question about the background of the pitcher plant. Was that a sedum on that last slide of the pitcher plant?
I think the only other plant that I noted within those photos was a blueberry. But that was just a slide ago. So as I resume the slideshow, I will go ahead and call that up and we'll take a look.
Thank you.
All right, let's see if we can back up. Okay, I do see some, appears to be blueberries in this lower right-hand corner. Again, in the center photo, I only see tamarack. This plant throughout here is sphagnum moss. And that may be what you were looking at. I do not see anything resembling sedum. This is blueberry. Vaccinium.
Okay.
Good question, though. All right, so let's move on from this beautiful scene of the open water lake-like area just beyond the floating mat, Beulah Bog. And we'll start to take a look at some of these middle spring flowering plants. And our
Wild geranium.
poster child here is wild geranium, Geranium maculatum. We'll see more of that plant in a subsequent slide. So we'll start with a couple of species of rue in the genus Thalictrum. And guess what? These are both in the crowfoot family. Once again, Ranunculaceae. Rue anemone is one of my favorites. It's a very delicate plant. Thalictrum, Thalictroides. We used to know it as Anemonella Thalictroides, but taxonomists and botanists in their infinite wisdom have decided to call it Thalictrum Thalictroides, which is a nonsensical name that translates into the thalictrum that looks like a thalictrum. Rue anemone will have anywhere from 6, 7, or 9 petals. What appear to be leaves below that white flower that you see on the left are actually a series of bracts. They're modified bracts, not true leaves. But that whorled structure is fairly distinctive. The early meadow rue on the right has a very different kind of flower structure. Thalictrum dioicum takes its name from the dioecious quality of the plant. And dioecious is a term that botanists use to describe plants on which the male and female flowers are borne on separate plants. So this is the staminate plant, the male flower, if you will. And there will be pollen coming out of those dangling anthers. Wood anemone, Anemone quinquefolia, is another crowfoot, another member of the Ranunculaceae. Leaves are 3 to 5 lobed, hence the name quinquefolia, meaning 5-leaved. It'll often form dense colonies like this, but never very large. So you see on the right, there's a good coverage of it here in a nice oak woodland at Pleasant Valley. And here on the left, you see them a little bit more scattered. You can probably tell from here, the leaves are kind of downy. They may have a slightly silvery quality when the light is just right. This is one of my favorites. It's a very beautiful plant of mesic, woodlands and savannas. Now we're going to take a look at 3 of the trillium species that occur in our area. And again, it used to be that we referred to these as being in the lily family. Nowadays, botanists and taxonomists are putting it into its own family, the Trilliaceae, the lily of 3. So prairie lily, Trillium recurvatum, is probably our most common. It's sometimes called the red trillium or prairie trillium, or bloody nose or butcher's trillium. It's got a variety of folk names. You'll notice the leaves are mottled, pale green and deep olive green in a random pattern. That's fairly distinctive. Some of our other trilliums are rare ones, will exhibit that, but not the other 2 we're going to look at, which are white flowering. The declined trillium, Trillium flexipes, has these narrow white petals, and you see the 3 white sepals behind it, 1, 2, 3, and then the petals in front. Now the leaves also come out in 3s. So this is how it is that trillium gets its name, lily of 3. 3 leaves, 3 petals, 3 sepals. But if you look back at the prairie trillium, you can see the 3 red petals and 3 leaves, but you wonder, well, where are the sepals? Well, in fact, the sepals are curved downward and they're hidden by the leaves. The sepals are underneath here. And that's those recurved sepals are how the common or the specific epithet recurvatum comes about, meaning the recurved sepals pointing downward. So we've got the prairie trillium, declined trillium, and then the large flowered trillium, Trillium grandiflora. And here you can see that the pedicel is mostly upright, whereas with the declined trillium, the pedicel comes out at a roughly horizontal angle. In the similar nodding trillium, it actually droops downward in an arc. So these 2 photos of the white trilliums, large flowered and declined trillium, both came from a site in the Hepatica National Wildlife Refuge, right near Genoa City, here in Walworth County. Those shots were taken last year. And if you're looking for the Turner Tract at Hackmatack, it is open to the public, and there's an entrance sign, small parking area, a couple of hiking trails on Highway H, just west of Genoa City. So between Genoa City and Lake Geneva. Shooting star is one of the common favorites amongst our spring wildflowers. Many people learn this as dodecatheon media. Nowadays they're calling it primula media, and it is in the primrose family. So here you can see the leaves, not yet fully grown. And if you look in the center of that cluster, there's a little flower bud. And that from end of April. And then this photo from the middle of May, showing both white and violet forms of the shooting star. Harlem Hills is a beautiful gravel prairie remnant in Rockford. It's just on the east side of the Rock River in Winnebago County. Extraordinary habitat and wonderful flora if you get a chance to visit there. It is managed by the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And here, a nice close-up photo of the shooting star from just a week ago at the Beulah Bluff Preserve, Kettle Moraine Land Trust. Shooting star. Okay, we'll take a look at our violets in the family Violaceae. I've chosen 3 just for their contrasts. There are lots of violets, lots of different species that grow in this area. Some of them are highly specialized and occur only in rare habitats. Others are more common. And again, I would ask you to please mute your microphones so as not to distract others. Thank you. So on the left, we have prairie violet, Viola pedatifida, from Beulah Bog. Take a look at the leaves. You'll see that they're deeply lobed. And this one has 3 distinct lobes. Down here below, this is more like 5 to 7 lobes. It gives the plant a characteristic that is, makes it look very similar to the bird's foot violet, which is Viola pedata. The best way to tell the difference between the two is that this prairie violet has bearded low petals, whereas the bird's foot violet is beardless. It also can have more variation in color between white and violet. Here in the center, you've got some white violets and some blue violets, and they're all the same species. They're all the common blue violet, Viola sororia. This is from Beulah Bluff last year. This is the very common violet that we see everywhere. It'll crop up in our lawns. It'll show up in prairies, old fields, woodlands. It'll persist in a lot of different environments that have undergone change over time. And then on the right, we've got the lovely yellow violet, the downy yellow violet. This is Viola pubescens from Natureland. And this is a robust violet. It'll get to be several inches tall. And very often these yellow flowers are held on tall pedicels that are taller than the leaves. And the leaves are fairly large themselves. So Viola pubescens, the downy yellow violet. There is also a smooth yellow violet, which looks similar, but doesn't have the peach fuzz along the stems. It's the same species, but a different subspecies or variety. And here's one of my personal favorites. This is wood betony, Pedicularis canadensis. And you see it in various stages of growth here. The small inset photo on the far left, you see the sort of magenta color of these leaves just beginning to unfurl very early in the spring. That's March 21st of this year. The center photo, a month later, you see the flowers have formed. And the flowers occur in these beautiful whorls. You know, the lower left photo is shot straight down, looking directly onto the tops of these blooming flowers. And each one is like a little snapdragon flower. In fact, it used to be in the snapdragon family, but now they've moved it into the broomrape family, the Orobanchaceae, in part because it's a hemiparasitic plant. And noticing here the larger photo, you still have this reddish color, this magenta color to the leaves. And early in the spring, when this plant first starts to emerge, it's not conducting photosynthesis. You know, if you don't see green, you don't see a plant acting as a producer. It is either tapping into a root storage system and taking food that it had set aside from last year's growth, or in the case of a pitcher plant, it is predominantly carnivorous and is getting its protein and other nutrients from other organisms, or it may be parasitic. And in this case, the wood betony is what they call hemiparasitic. That is to say, it is partly parasitic. So early in the spring, before it's conducting photosynthesis, when it looks like this, or it looks like this, it's taking its nutrients from neighbors' root systems. So it's hemiparasitic on grasses, we know, and they suspect also potentially on oak roots. Now, later in the season, you know, here, for example, this May 19th photo from a year ago, the leaves have all turned green. So they don't stay red throughout the season. And this plant, once it's got a jump start from its parasite host, starts to produce its own food. But the fact that it's hemiparasitic has made it very useful for land managers who are looking to break up the sod of prairie restorations that have perhaps an aggressive component of tall grasses. And they want to be able to loosen that up a little bit, provide inroads for forbs or other more conservative graminoid species to take hold. Introducing wood betony to the site will help to accomplish that. We're going to take a look at 3 views of ck-in-the-Pulpit that were all taken from the same visit to the same site, but they show varying phases of growth. So Aracema triphyllum, the genus Aracema is in the family of Ericaceae, or Araceae rather. And the Araceae or arum family is also the family of the skunk cabbage. So once again, we're going to see a plant that has a spathe and spadex flower structure. So in the first photo, you're seeing just a shoot coming up. And you can see that in the very center tip of that, there's a green spiral. That's going to be the leaf structure. What you're seeing here, the mottled form that occupies most of the structure here, that's just a sheath. A little further along, here you can see the sheath has started to fade in color and it's started to lean back. You've got a mottled stem. You have 3 leaflets, 1, 2, 3, and then this is going to be the spathe. This is going to be the hood. Now, again, these were both taken the same day, different plants. One is further along in its development than the other. And then here it is in full glorious bloom in the sunshine with 3 leaflets, with the spathe or the hood, or in this case, what you might call a pulpit, and then the spadix, the jack in the pulpit. And these can be true green, or they can be dotted with or streaked with madder colors, you know, reds and burgundies and browns. And you may ask why it is that the same species is in 3 different phases of growth, all on the same day, all on the same site. Now, some of that may be microclimate. It may be cooler in some areas than others, but it's also a fairly sensible approach for a plant to take, so that not all members of the species are in bloom at exactly the same time, because there's no way of knowing whether their necessary pollinators are going to be present on the same day or the same week. So staggering the growth and staggering the bloom time is definitely a good strategy for success. And with that, we're going to go ahead and move on to our woody plant chapter. And we've
Greg,
yes.
could I interrupt you just for a moment?
Yes.
would you be able to do the general mute on everyone? I think we would eliminate that background noise if you could, as the host, could do the mute.
Yes, let me do that.
Bingo. Oh, yeah, good.
All right. Thank you for waiting. We have a nice photo here of the large kettle at our Beulah Bluff Preserve. So we've got hickories and oaks and a few dead ash surrounding the kettle. There's a beautiful array of wildflowers there. Bottom of the kettle has a nice population of yellow pimpernel. I did not include that in today's presentation because it blooms a little bit later. So maybe someday we'll do another slideshow that can feature yellow pimpernel. But for now, we're going to look at some woody plants. So we'll start with a native shrub, Corylus americana, hazel or American hazel or hazelnut. And this was a very common, widespread understory shrub of pioneer days. The surveyors who conducted public land surveys in the 1840s often noted hazel brush being a conspicuous member of the communities through which they passed. And it is a remnant in some areas. This photo taken last year along Territorial Road. This is just growing along the roadside. And what you're seeing, these dangling yellow catkins, are the male flowers of the hazel. And here you see a photo of it at Peterson Island Woods Preserve. You know, it's a nice, delicate understory shrub. It'll form small thickets, usually a cluster of single upright stems that get to be no more than an inch or two in diameter. And what we've seen thus far are the aments or catkins. These are the staminate flowers. The pistillate flowers are tiny but showy. And you know, here you can see a photo with these little magenta structures just sticking out of this tight little bract. That's as open as the flowers ever get. So that is just enough of a pistillate structure to accept the pollen that is windborne, having blown off the catkins of neighboring hazel. So each one of those little magenta flowers has the potential to form one or a pair of nuts. And the hazelnut is a delicious, much sought after food, beloved of squirrels. Other native shrubs, we've got wild plum here on the left, Prunus americana. It's in the same genus with our wild cherries, the black cherry, the choke cherry, sand cherry. The wild plum does bear a plum-like fruit. It's a little bit smaller than your commercial plums, of course, but it is perfectly edible. It does have a large stone. So you don't get a lot of flesh, and you don't want to eat too many of them because there are trace amounts of strychnine in the skin. It's not to say it's poisonous unless you overdo it. But wild plum, Prunus americana, will form thickets. It'll grow on prairie edges, savanna edges, and it's another lovely landscape plant, especially for those who have a buckthorn hedge or screen that they'd like to get rid of. This is one that you can plant and it'll fill in nicely and it'll spread on its own. Off to the right, another white flowering native shrub. This is pagoda dogwood, Cornus alternifolia, sometimes known as alternate-leaved dogwood. It's the only member of the genus that has the alternate leaf and stem structure. All the other dogwoods have opposite branching. The name pagoda comes from its tiered structure. You can see the sort of horizontal strata. And each of the flower clusters are held on a little upright umbel. So it's quite beautiful in the spring. Mine is flowering right now. And in fact, this is a photo of mine taken 5 years ago. It also gets beautiful fall color. It can be orange to red, depending on how much stress it's under. During a drought year, mine turned very red. Most years, it's kind of a golden yellow orange. And then in the center, sandbar willow, Salix interior. This is from our Jackson Creek Preserve, and you can see the catkins, the flowers forming like pussy willows that blooms fairly early in the year. The leaves are rather narrow compared to their length. This is a shrub willow, not a tree willow. It forms thickets. It is colonial, and it can actually be weedy. If a site like this doesn't get fire frequently enough, it will start to get aggressive. And it's one that I'm looking to control with fire at our Jackson Creek Preserve. No presentation on our native flora would be complete without at least a tip of the hat to the oaks. Oaks occur in the genus Quercus within the Fabaceae or beech family. There are 4 common species throughout our area. There are about a dozen species that are native to the region. This happens to be one of our more common ones, Quercus ellipsoidalis, known as Hills oak. Locally, it's also known as northern pin oak. And again, the flowers are born in these dangling clusters. And here you see clusters of flowers, and then the pinkish leaves as they're just starting to unfurl. And you also see that pinkish quality here in the hickory to the right as the leaves are unfolding, the bracts fold back. And the hickories also have these dangling flower structures. These, like the hazel, are wind pollinated, but these obviously bloom rather much later. The hickories, we've got 2 local species, the shagbark hickory, Caria ovata, and then the bitternut hickory, Caria cordiformis. Here are a couple of vines. I framed the left photo in green and the right photo, or the left photo in red and the right photo in green, because the left one is poison ivy, Toxicodendron radicans, from which some people can deal with a skin rash as a result of handling the plant. Virginia creeper on the right is safe in that regard. People generally don't have any kind of allergic reaction to the plant tissue of Virginia creeper. Poison ivy is in the cashew family or sumac family, Anacardiaceae, whereas the Virginia creeper is in the grape family, Vitaceae. Poison ivy will have the 3 leaflets. Sometimes you get this mitten shape on the lateral leaflets. Sometimes they're more deeply toothed, other times less so. It can have great variability in the shape. It can appear as a ground cover or a trailing vine or a climbing vine. It can be quite robust with aerial roots. Virginia creeper, on the other hand, again, note quinquifolia, meaning 5-leaved. So it will have 5 leaflets, palmately compound. It will typically adhere to the trunk it's climbing with aerial roots that end in little suction cups rather than digging directly into the bark. It can be difficult to tell without the leaves. So if in doubt about a climbing stem like this, best to avoid it. But they're both native and they both occur in our woodlands and forested areas. Poison ivy will also occur in floodplains. So it has a wider range of habitat requirements. Okay, let's move into our last section before it gets too late. here in the late spring. The photo of our Beulah Bluff Preserve at the end of May from last year. Let's take a look at 4 of our sedges. And for those who may not be familiar, sedges are graminoid plants, meaning they're grass-like, but they're in a very different family, the Cyperaceae, whereas the grasses are in the Poaceae. They differ in a number of ways, but superficially, sedges look a bit like grasses. But the Cyperaceae family is huge. There are more than 5,500 members of the family. Even the genus, and the sedges occur in the genus Carex. That genus has more than 2,000 species worldwide, of which we have more than 100 species of sedge right here in our area. So we're only going to touch upon a few representative examples that are relatively common. So common oak sedge, Carex pennsylvanica, is one that often forms these beautiful, delicate stands. It looks like an inviting place for a picnic. It's soft, grassy. The sedges don't typically get much taller than what would seem like about 6 inches because they're folded over a little bit. They bow. So the total length of those blades will be closer to a foot, but the height of the stand is fairly short-statured. Common oak sedge, sometimes known as pen sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. Now here's the short-headed bracted sedge. The name was a little too long to fit in my label there, so I just called it abracted sedge. But Carex cephalophora, short-headed bracted sedge. It's indicative of our oak savannas and woodlands to a certain extent, from mesic to dry mesic environments. If you look closely, you can see on top of these flowering culms are clusters of these little, globe-like structures. These are the spikelets, which were clusters of flowers that are about to bear the fruiting structures, which in sedges are called perigynia. And here on the curly-styled wood sedge, you can see distinctly clusters of these sac-like perigynia, each of which will contain a single hard nut of a seed that's called an achene. You'll pick up right away that sedges have their own vocabulary. The structures are so distinctive, the botanists have very specialized names for all the different plant parts. Curly styled refers to the fact that there are little styles that stick out. This is a part of the pistil. It's the portion that connects the stigma to the ovary. And in this particular species, the styles are curled like ram's horns. Otherwise, it superficially looks very much like the straight-styled wood sedge, Carex radiata. So as with many of the sedges, the only way to be sure of what species you've got is to catch them at just the right time of year when the perigynia are ripening, and you can look at them sometimes with a dissecting microscope to get to the high detail. And then finally, one of our wetland sedges, this is common tussock sedge, Carex stricta. And this is the one that forms those humps, hummocks, or tussocks that we see in some of our sedge meadows and other wetlands. It's a buildup of soil and root mass over a long period of time. It may take, decades, if not hundreds of years to form some of these tussocks. So it's a delicate environment. And each tussock is something of an ecosystem unto itself. This is very early in the growing season for the Carex species. So these are just flower buds. They haven't opened yet. These dark, almost black structures are the pistillate spikes. So those will form the perigynia or the fruiting part. The staminate flower spikes occur on the same plant, and in fact on the same culm. They're difficult to make out in this photo. They're straw-colored, rather smaller, and they occur below the pistillate structures. So 4 of our sedges in the genus Carex. Okay, back to the showier flowers. Here's Jacob's ladder, Polemonium reptans. You'll notice that it has the petals that nearly fuse into a bell-like structure, and it is the leaf pattern that gives it the common name Jacob's ladder. And here you can see the ladder-like pattern of the leaves. And this is a plant of mesic savannas, meaning they like the middle portion of the hydrological spectrum, not too wet, not too dry. But it will grow in wetter prairies and in fact in fens, fens being calcareous wetlands with a slow flow of water. Okay, now we come to the Mayapple page, Podophyllum peltatum. We got a glimpse of this from the Beulah Bog photos, but here you can see the leaves fully emerged, and I mentioned they were umbrella-like. The name Podophyllum means foot leaf. So these leaves come down off a stem, and if you looked at a Mayapple plant upside down, if you cut it off at the base and turned it upside down, you would see that the two leaves come off of leg-like branches of the stem, and they look a little bit like feet. But peltatum also refers to the shape of the leaf. Peltate is a botanical term that means shaped like a shield. And in this case, they mean the shields of the ancient Greeks, which were round. So the botanical name translates into foot leaf shield shaped. And here are some low views of it so you can see the flower. The flowers are rather large, size of a silver dollar or larger. And for those of you who are young enough not to have seen many silver dollars, let's just say a couple of inches across. Flowers are white and they do not bear nectaries. So what it is that attracts the pollinators is not the nectar, it is the pollen itself. And Mayapple plants have really protein-rich pollen, which is especially great for our bumblebees because they will come and collect that pollen, and those queens that are collecting pollen early in the season really need to bulk up on protein so that they can produce an adequate brood of young, which will become the workers for the season ahead. So this is a common plant of our woodlands and the savannas. Again, it tends to form colonies. You'll see it associating with sedges. Here in the foreground on the left photo, this is Carex blanda, one of our woodland sedges. And then here again, Carex pennsylvanica, our common oak sedge on the right. And here's wild geranium, Geranium maculatum. Again, it's one of the showy flowers that's blooming right now. So you can get out and see this. It's conspicuous from roadsides that pass by woodlands. You'll find it in sunny areas of woodlands or various areas of savannas. Another common name for the plants in this genus is cranesbill. And it gets that name because the seed pods that form before they ripen and burst open are pointed and shaped like the beak of a crane. Columbine is a crowd favorite, Aquilegia canadensis. And this is a showy flower, a variety of shady habitats. It likes rich mesic woodlands, and it also will grow in limestone outcrops. I have seen this in canyon walls with columbine growing directly out of crevices in the rock. Briefly, I'm going to touch on these horse gentians because they bloom a little later in the year, but they can be conspicuous at this time of year. Here, for example, the center photo from May 9th of this year, the plant is already getting to be quite tall. And this will get to be waist high by the time it's done growing. Two very similar species. So the one on the left is the early horse gentian, Triosteum aurantiacum, and the two photos on the right are the late horse gentian, Triosteum perfoliatum. And they're very similar in their flower structure. They're essentially similar in overall look. They both flower from leaf axils. Here you can see one of the flowers already formed, and you may detect the shape of the flower. It's in the honeysuckle family, the Caprifoliaceae. When the fruits ripen, they look like little cherry tomatoes studding the leaf axils. But one way to tell these two species apart is the leaf structure. Triosteum perfoliatum has these perfoliate leaves. It looks as if these opposite leaves were in fact one common structure perforated by the stem vertically. And here you see on the early horse gentian or Antiochum that the leaves clasp the stem at the same node, but they do not seem to fuse together in this perfoliate manner. And here you can see the leaf structure just starting to form along the stem. This is a plant of our savannas predominantly, but also occasionally woodlands. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping up, but something that people often ask about is how to tell the difference between Solomon's seal, the true Solomon's seal, and what's sometimes called false Solomon's seal or Solomon's plume. And the reason they ask this is that the plants superficially look very, very similar. They have parallel veins in the leaves. They have these clasping leaves that alternate up a stiff, fleshy stem. And it's not entirely diagnostic. You can't tell this for sure. It doesn't always exhibit itself, but generally speaking, the Solomon's plume will have a sort of a maroon base to the stem. You see in the lower right photos that the sort of dark reddish bottom of the stem. Whereas in the true Solomon's seal, it'll be green all the way down with a bluish tint and sometimes a little purple. So again, these are not diagnostics that you can really rely on until you've really had a chance to get to see this plant and know it in the field. And I've planted both of these in my home gardens, and that's where these photos are taken from, which makes it a little bit easier for me to keep track of what's where and what it looks like at different times of the growing season. So the real giveaway on these two species is the location of the flowers. So here on the left, you see flower buds forming in the leaf axils. So the flowers are going to emerge from the same node where the leaf attaches to the stem. Whereas in this flower, you see flower buds forming at a terminal raceme, a little cluster of flowers at the tip. Of course, the flowers on the left will remain green. The flowers on the right, when they open, will be white. So we have the true Solomon's seal on the left, Polygonatum biflorum. And biflorum means two-flowered. And very often these flowers do appear in pairs, although I've often seen them in clusters of 3 or more. So that's not entirely reliable. But certainly on the Solomon's plume, the feathery Solomon's plume, you'll have a terminal cluster of flowers. Myanthemum racemosum, again from the term raceme, which refers to that terminal flower cluster. A lot of people learned this Solomon's plume as Smilacina racemosa. Either way, feathery Solomon's plume. There is another similar species, the starry Solomon's plume, which tends to occur more often in prairies than in woodlands. It has fewer flowers in the terminal cluster, with more widely spaced and with longer, narrower petals, so that it has a star-like aspect. And then the fruits are the final giveaway. Solomon's seal fruits are blue when ripe. Solomon's plume are red when ripe. And the starry Solomon's plume are a darker color when ripe and have a star-like pattern on them. Okay, 2 more plants to go. Kittentails, Bessia bullii. And I had to include this one, even though it's only just starting to flower. because this is a state-threatened species in Wisconsin. And it's most abundant in the state right here in the southeastern corner. So Bessia bullii, a plant of savannas and of rocky gravel prairies. Here you see it from one of our sites in Beulah. It's got these oval-shaped basal leaves. In the early spring, they'll curl up like this, fuzzy, very fuzzy. Colline leaves along the stems, the flowering stems. You'll have these clasping toothed leaves. And then here, a little later in the season, this again, Winnebago County on a private site. It's got the broad oval leaves and a tall spike of creamy yellow flowers. So here, the flower stems are just getting started. Kittentails, a rare plant of our savannas. And then finally, I wanted to close with a photo that's maybe had a little more dramatic lighting. And this is actually just a ray of sunlight reaching the violet wood sorrel, Oxalis violaceae. This photo was taken, I believe, at Glacial Park. 5 petals, typical of the Oxalis genus. The other members of the genus in our area have yellow flowers. And this is the only one with the purple flowers, violet colored, violaceae. And like other members of the wood sorrel group, they take its name Oxalis from the oxalic acid that is present in the stems and the leaves and the flowers, giving it a kind of a sour taste. So we're just about 8 o'clock. I do want to end on time. I'm more than willing to stay on the line if people have questions or want to chat about any of these locations or any of these flowers. I've left my email address here, greg@kmlandtrust.org. I trust that all of you know where to find me or find Sue. We're happy to help you with any thing that we can. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen so I can bring us back into video mode. If people want to unmute or show themselves, you're welcome to do so now. Hey there. I can unmute all of you. Okay. I can't show all of your videos at once. If you want to show your video, you'll have to do that yourself.
Hi, Greg. This is Dawn Marie. That was great. Thank you so much.
The wild geranium this morning, and it's great to see that it made your picture show.
Oh, good. You know, I'm trying to unmute everybody.
It's a famous flower.
It says all participants are unmuted. Maybe you now have to physically unmute yourself now that I've set unmute all. Oh, the glitches.
Well, we've learned a lot.
You know, it's funny, I keep clicking on unmute all and it keeps telling me that all participants are unmuted. If anyone is trying to unmute yourself and unable to do so, then tell us through chat and we'll make sure that we make an effort to let you be heard. Yeah, it could be some of you are just overriding my unmute all by muting yourselves.
Great job, Greg. I now know why some plants are named the way that they are, and I have a greater appreciation, and actually very helpful for distinguishing plants, especially with those Solomon seals. I mean, I had an idea of what they were, but now I know better tools. I have better tools now.
Good. Thank you. One more note about Solomon seal. The common name Solomon seal comes from the fact that it has a perennial underground root system, and every year it sends up a new shoot. And that means that last year's shoot scar remains on the root, and those scars are circular. And people thought that it reminded them of the seal of King Solomon. A little bit of lore. Well, then I will let you know that I am planning to do more of these. They won't all be quite so plant-centric. We'll try to do some other topics as well. Sue and I are going to put together an exit survey that we'll send you. If you can reply to that survey, it will be very helpful for us to be able to plan future programs, and we'll be able to use that information